So good evening, everyone. My name is Anupama Rao, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's annual Ambedkar Lecture on behalf of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society and the Ambedkar Initiative. Our initiative links the anti-caste legacies of political theorist and constitutional thinker B.R. Ambedkar, who studied at Columbia University, with enduring concerns about historical inequality and its redress. There could not be a more important time to recognize those who've come before us and their relentless struggle for respect, dignity, and social justice. And we're pleased for the institutional support of the many units across the university that made this evening possible. The Office of the EVP of Arts and Sciences, the Barnard Provost's Office, the Office of the Deans of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, the new Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, the Department of Middle East, South Asian and African Studies, the libraries, and Columbia University Press. We've been waiting all semester to welcome our guest this evening, and it's my very great honor and immense pleasure to welcome Isabel Wilkerson, who'll speak this evening on the topic of race, caste, and social justice. She'll speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll open the floor to Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes thereafter. I'll collect about 2 to 3 questions at a time for maximal engagement and read them out. Isabel Wilkerson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Humanities Medal, is the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestsellers, The Warmth of Other Suns, and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Wilkerson's work, in the words of the American Prospect magazine, is the missing piece of our country's history. The Warmth of Other Suns won the National Book Critics Circle Award, amongst other honors, and was named to more than 30 Best of the Year lists, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post. Time magazine named it one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the decade, and the New York Times magazine named Warmth to its list of the best nonfiction books of all time. Her new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, was published in August 2020 to critical acclaim, and soon thereafter became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Dwight Garner of the New York Times calls it an instant American classic, and almost certainly the keynote nonfiction book of the American century so far. Oprah Winfrey chose it as her best 2020 Summer-Fall Book Club selection, declaring it the most important book she had ever selected. Wilkerson won the Pulitzer Prize for her deeply humane narrative, writing while serving as Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times in 1994, making her the first Black woman in the history of American journalism to win a Pulitzer Prize, and the first African American to win for individual reporting. In 2016, President Barack Obama awarded Wilkerson the National Humanities Medal for championing the stories of an unsung history. As the historian Jill Lepore observed in The New Yorker, what Wilkerson urges isn't argument at all, it's compassion. Hush and listen. Please join me in welcoming Isabel Wilkerson this evening. I've already explained to her that had she been here with us in person, we would have feted her and taken her out to dinner after this, and it would have been a very different kind of a social event. But I'm really so very, very pleased that she's joining us nonetheless this evening. And Dr. Wilkerson, a big, big welcome. And thank you for being our speaker this evening for the annual Ambedkar Lecture.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It is such an honor to be speaking at a lecture series named after Dr. Ambedkar. I have spent the better part of the last 15 or 20 years immersed in, dedicated to, focused on the idea of caste, the phenomenon, the human phenomenon of caste, the psychology of caste, the ways that it affects intergroup relations, and how it relates to a country that we do not normally usually associate it with, meaning the United States. I would like to, I guess, first start with the idea of, how it has been used in the past, how it's been referred to in the past. And it takes me back to the middle of the 19th century when the Massachusetts senator and abolitionist Charles Sumner used the term that people even now are unaccustomed to hearing applied to the United States. He was fighting slavery in the South and segregation in the North, and he used the term caste. He said, there's a quote, "The separation of children in the public schools of Boston on account of color or race is in the nature of caste," he wrote, "and on this account is a violation of equality." He quoted a fellow humanitarian. He said, "Caste makes distinctions where God has made none." The word caste, of course, has been associated more often, of course, with the millennia-long system of graded hierarchy in South Asia, particularly in India. But we know that the word comes from the Portuguese word casta, referring to breed or stock, and has found its way into Western thought in scholarly circles in particular for at least the last century and a half. In the United States, even people in the dominant, what I would call the dominant caste, have long seen the connection. Madison Grant, a leading eugenicist at the turn of the 20th century, actually said this. He said, "A record of the desperate efforts of the conquering upper classes in India to preserve the purity of their blood persists until this very day in their carefully regulated system of castes. In our southern states, Jim Crow cars and social discriminations have exactly the same purpose." Now, this does not mean that he had an accurate portrayal of caste in India, but he, as a eugenicist and a leading member of a group that was seeking to maintain white supremacy, proudly so, felt a deep connection to the graded hierarchy across the oceans and across the centuries. And then, of course, in the 1930s, anthropologists like Allison Davis and John Dollard traveled to the South, to the American South, which was the birthplace of Jim Crow, the birthplace of what I would call caste, the birthplace of course, the United States as a whole. When you think about colonial Virginia, they traveled to the southern states that Madison Grant was speaking of, and they traveled there to live and to study and to understand, to do participant observation, ethnography in the land that was the birthplace of what would be considered the most formal manifestation of caste in the United States. And they emerged from their immersion using the word caste as well. There was also another American sociologist from whom I have taken a great deal of inspiration, named Gerald Berryman. He is alone in scholars, I might say, one of the few scholars in the world who actually lived both in India and in the Jim Crow South. Very, very few people who've studied this lived in both. Of course, it's not really possible in the same way because the Jim Crow South does not exist in the same way that it did, but he lived in both places, and he emerged from his ethnographic field work in both India and in the American South, convinced on the basis of both his years of professional research, his years of participant observation, and his lived experience in both cultures that the word caste applied to both. He wrote, "The human meaning of caste for those who live it is power and vulnerability, privilege and oppression, honor and denigration, plenty and want, reward and deprivation, security and anxiety. A description of caste which fails to convey this is a travesty." And then in 1959, the winter of 1959, Dr. Martin Luther King made a historic trip to India. And he'd always wanted to get to India because he had been inspired by the nonviolent protests of Mohandas Gandhi. He wanted very much to be able to see the land of Gandhi, and he made this historic trip there in the winter of 1959. There he was received as a visiting dignitary. People in India had been following very closely the civil rights movement that he was leading. They were following very closely the efforts toward human full equal rights for people who were at the bottom of the society in America at that time. And so he was viewed as a visiting dignitary everywhere he went. He made a trip to the south of the country, to Kerala, and there he he went and visited a high school where the students were from what was then known as the untouchable caste, now the Dalits. And upon arrival, the schoolmaster, the principal, introduced Dr. Martin Luther King in this way. He said, "Young people, I want to introduce you to a fellow untouchable from the United States of America." Now, that means that he recognized and they recognized him as as a parallel or connected group of people. They recognized him as being from the bottom of the society from which he had come. But when Dr. Martin Luther King heard that term untouchables applied to him, he bristled from it. He was a bit peeved and uncomfortable with that term. He did not see himself in that way. He actually, thought to himself, I had dinner with the prime minister. How in the world could they see me as an untouchable? Clearly, I am not that. But then he started to think about the people that he had been representing, the 20 million African Americans who were at that very moment being held in a fixed place, being held down at the bottom of that society, prohibited from being able to vote. The vast majority of them in the South were living in the South and thus prevented from being able to vote. They were prohibited from public accommodations. They were being held in a fixed place, and their efforts to reach equality, to petition for equality, were met with vociferous hostility and violence. And he thought about those 20 million people he was representing, and he said to himself, I am an untouchable, and every Negro in the United States of America is an untouchable. So at that moment, Dr. Martin Luther King came to the recognition, as a result of the Indian recognition of his placement in a hierarchy that they themselves saw in that moment as being similar to, not exact, not a replica of, but had enough similarities that they could themselves see the connection that they had to him. And so that was how he even came to the recognition that there was more to what he was fighting than just race itself, that there was something underneath it, this infrastructure of division, the infrastructure of what I call the infrastructure of the discontents. Then, 50 years after that visit, I ended up being one of two African-American women who had books on the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, this book that I wrote, The Warmth of the Suns, was on the bestseller list, and the seminal work by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, was also on the bestseller list in 2010. We had been working on our books completely separately. We had never met each other. We did not know what the other was working on. We had no idea of each other's works. And yet when these books came out, both of us, independent of each other, on the basis of the research that we had done, the deep immersion in the work that we had done, both came out with books that were using the term caste to describe the phenomenon that each of us were independently writing about, that each of us was investigating. And this takes me back to 1946, when Dr. Ambedkar reached out to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois after he read that Black Americans were petitioning the United Nations for protection as minorities. And Dr. Ambedkar told Dr. Du Bois that he had been, quote, a student of the Negro Problem from across the oceans and recognized the common fates. He said, quote, there is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and the position of the Negroes in America, Ambedkar wrote, that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary. And it was that premise, that exhortation, that propelled me to write the second book, to look more deeply at the unseen infrastructure, the human impulse to control and subjugate groups that are seen as other. This book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, and I must emphasize that the subtitle is central to understanding the purpose of this book. This is a book by an American, foremost about America, for an American audience, at a time of existential crisis in American history, when all other explanations seem to have failed us. This book is not about the totality of India. This book is not attempting to recount the millennia-long history of India and its complex hierarchies of Varnas and Jatis. There are volumes upon volumes addressing the issues of caste in India, and there is no debate that a caste system has existed in India. There is, however, very little mainstream thought in America about how caste might be at work in this country and what each country, each society might learn from one another. We all know that there are massive differences between India and the United States, but few people are in a position to truly know the points of intersection and the depths of hierarchy in the United States, because few people truly know the full history of how the United States subjugated the group it assigned to the lowest rung for most of the country's history. Nor would most people have the chance to know the lived experience of the people subjugated and stigmatized in the American version of caste. A true assessment of caste in the United States cannot be fully understood unless it goes along with, unless we have a full and comprehensive knowledge of the American South, not only the birthplace of caste in America, but with colonial Virginia, the birthplace of the United States itself. We are accustomed to seeing, and people are accustomed to seeing, the colored only signs. They see the footage of the fire hoses that were trained on civil rights workers, but they do not see and could not know of the formal, legal, official, embedded infrastructure of graded ranking and boundaries enforced to keep each group in a fixed place in this society. I came to the awareness of caste in the American context in researching The Warmth of the Suns, the first book I wrote. I was recounting the exodus, the defection of 6 million African Americans out of the Jim Crow South to the rest of the country from the time of World War I until the 1970s. For that book, I interviewed over 1,200 people who had survived the Jim Crow regime. It was a world in which it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. You could go to jail if you were caught playing checkers with a person of a different race. In courtrooms throughout the South, there was a Black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. The very word of God was segregated in the Jim Crow South. The same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races, because across the oceans, across continents, across time and space, both of these societies latched on to the central pillar, the central hallmark of caste, which is purity and pollution. And the very word of God could not be touched by hands of different races in the Jim Crow South, the caste system, as I describe it, of Jim Crow. They were not to be seen in the dominant caste neighborhoods or even entire towns after sunset. These jurisdictions were known as sundown towns. These were matters of life and death. Any breach of the caste system could mean your very life. Every 4 days in the first 4 decades of the 20th century, an African American was lynched for some perceived breach of the caste system. Walking into the wrong door, not tipping one's hat, not stepping off the sidewalk and into the gutter fast enough, and of course the unilateral breach of the laws of endogamy. Which would mean any untoward remark or gesture toward a white woman, a woman who I would describe as being in the dominant caste, particularly in the South, but also outside of the South as well. This formal, official hierarchy was in place in the United States for far longer than it has not. While India, with its new constitution, outlawed untouchability in late 1949, early 1950, the United States did not outlaw these prohibitions until the 1960s, 1964, 65, and 1968. And then they were belatedly adopted and with resentment and with resistance not until the 1970s. We know in both of these societies that laws on the books are sometimes no match for the laws of the human heart. We know that laws are only as strong as the common will to uphold them. The opportunity for Black people to join the mainstream of American life in this country is a very, very, very new idea. It only dates back, as I'm indicating, to the 1960s and the 1970s. This is within the lifespan of many, many, many adults alive today. In fact, enslavement lasted for 246 years, enslavement being the foundation and the basis of what I call, of my definition here, based on all the research that I did, the definition of caste being an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in a society which determines standing, respect, benefit of the doubt, access to resources or deprivation of access to resources, assumptions of competence, intelligence, and beauty even. Through no fault or action of one's own, if you are born into a hereditarily based caste system, a hereditarily based hierarchy, such as that as I'm describing. And then, of course, the one of the main signatures that of enforcement would be the idea, the investment of upholding the hierarchy by the policing of the boundaries to make sure that everyone stays in a fixed place, that everyone stays and everyone has a role, everyone has a function in society, and that function and location must be policed at all costs. That is the nature of what a caste system can do. And that is that in the United States, it began as a bipolar hierarchy in which the British colonists established themselves as the uppermost caste, and established, first of all, they decimated the numbers of indigenous people, drove them from the land, and then transported Africans to the soil to be enslaved, to build the colony out of wilderness, to build what would ultimately become the United States. That institution that they created, in which they were assigning a group of people on the basis of phenotype, on the basis of what we now believe to call race, the idea of an idea which is fairly new in human history. The idea of race is only 400 or 500 years old. It grew out of the transatlantic slave trade and out of the exploration by Europeans to places in the rest of the world in which they encountered people who looked different from them, and thus established this fairly new idea of race that has been around for a short period of time in the long arc of human history, but just long enough to be assumed to be the general laws of nature. And so in the American system, there is the infrastructure of division, the infrastructure of the arbitrary graded ranking of human value that was connected to one's function in society, to be enslaved or to be free, to be able to have all the rights and privileges of citizenship or to have no rights whatsoever. And in the American form of hierarchy, the Q, the signifier, the measure, the metric could have been any number of things as in other societies. It could have, religion, birthplace, ethnicity, any number of things could be used as a metric to determine or apportion rights, privileges, or to withhold rights and privileges, to place people in a hierarchy. In the American version of this, race became the tool, the signifier, the cue, or the signal as to where a person was affixed, where a person was said to belong in the hierarchy that was created here in this country. And what that meant was that what a person looked like determined what they could do in society, because race became the signifier, the tool, the measure, and the metric to determine where a person fit in the hierarchy. We have lived with this for so long that we still now live under the shadow of this originating hierarchy. We can see evidence of this hierarchy in our everyday lives, in which people who have an investment in maintaining this hierarchy seek to maintain what they believe to be their birthright as the supreme or superior group, and that they will inject themselves into the lives of those who were born to this historically subjugated group, calling the police on them for routine things, calling the police on them if they are a bird watcher, a black bird watcher in Central Park, with the temerity to actually tell a woman who perceived herself as being above him from a dominant or superior group, or I would say caste, the temerity to tell her that her dog was run loose, and she responded by calling the police on him and thus endangering his life. There have been many cases that we have seen of people intruding upon the lives of people who are from the subjugated group to position them, to police them, to correct them as to where they actually belong in the society. When I was mentioning enslavement, I have to say this to give a sense of how very new the idea of African Americans being incorporated into the larger body politic and incorporated into the mainstream of American life is a very new proposition. Enslavement lasted from 1619 until 1865. It lasted for 246 years. How many greats do you have to add to the word grandparent to begin to imagine, to begin to comprehend how long enslavement lasted in this country? For 12 generations of enslavement, 12 generations of enslavement. And then that was followed by nearly 100 years of a formal, legal, official caste system in the Jim Crow South, in which everything that a person could or could not do was based upon what they look like. Enslavement alone lasted for so long that it will not be until the year 2022 that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as enslavement lasted on this soil. It will not be until the year 2022 that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as enslavement lasted on this soil. And no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as they were enslaved. That will not happen until the year 2111. That is how foundational enslavement was to this country, how central it was to the founding and infrastructure of the divisions that we see today, and how long it lasted in this country. And again, that is not including the additional 100 years, nearly 100 years of formal Jim Crow segregation, in which everything that a person could or could not do was based upon what they look like, and any breach of that caste system could literally mean one's life. It was not until the 1960s and 70s that African Americans, those who've been born to this historically subordinated, subjugated group in the United States, were allowed to move into the mainstream of American life. And we have seen in the current era how the shadow of these hierarchies have been with us, have resurged in our current day. We have seen with COVID-19, for example, how the occupational restrictions on the subjugated group, people who were, for the vast majority of time that there's been in the United States, were restricted to the role of servant, restricted to the role of working in the fields, that was overwhelmingly the role, the function of people in the subordinated group in the United States, African Americans. How that during the current era of coronavirus, how particularly in the early going of coronavirus, the people who were most at risk of contracting, getting sickened by, and even perishing as a result of coronavirus were those who were descended from those in the subordinated group. Those people who were the bus drivers who were out exposed to the general public without PPE, the people who were stacking shelves at a supermarket and were thus exposed to the general public, those people who were delivering groceries and delivering other goods to the people who had the luxury of being able to shelter in place. They were the ones who were on the front lines. In addition to that, these are the people who were less likely to have health insurance, less likely to be able to have access to adequate health care. And when they entered the medical system, they found themselves confronting what has been empirically proven over and over and over again. Study after study has shown that in the medical system, Black and brown people were entering a system in which, as educated as the medical professionals might have been, they too harbor the unconscious biases, which are the engine, the fuel for the inequalities and the maintenance and policing of caste in our society. They were harboring these assumptions and stereotypes, false assumptions and stereotypes that Black and brown people, for example, do not experience, falsely, again, do not experience pain at the same level that their white counterparts do. So they were entering a world that also harbored stereotypes that would have made it more difficult for them to get equal treatment as they sought care for coronaviruses that they might have contracted. And we saw this summer the most extreme case, the most extreme examples of how people in a subordinated group are still the victims of violence, violence at any moment. We have seen what happened to a young girl outside of Delhi who was viciously raped just this summer, around the same time that we saw what happened to George Floyd. We have actually witnessed people killed before our very eyes, people from the subjugated groups whose lives have been devalued from the very beginning and continue to be devalued. I would like to close by saying that one of the greatest tragedies in all of human history is the false divisions within our species on the basis of arbitrary boundaries by whatever means that a dominating group has chosen to impose. These false and arbitrary divisions on the basis of lineage, ethnicity, phenotype, birthplace, in other words, on the basis of factors that not one of us has control over, are toxic, destructive not just for the communities and nations, but the species itself. These encoded rankings and divisions seep into the subconscious, gain traction and adherence up and down the hierarchy, susceptible people with an investment in maintaining familiar rankings, and turn people who would otherwise be allies into antagonists, competing for survival and advantage in a system of manufactured scarcity. It is time that everyone, wherever we may be situated in our respective hierarchies, awaken from the programming, awaken to the toxicity, awaken to the common plight, and transcend the false barriers that we have inherited, and end caste wherever it rears itself, for the good of those who suffer under it, and for the good of humankind. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much. As you can imagine, we've got questions coming in. And if I may, I'll read out the first two questions that we have. But before that, I think I also wanted to note that one of the really magnificent things about Caste, the book, is the ways in which it really speaks to the psychic life of inequality, of subjugation, of stigma, of humiliation. And in many ways, it's a kind of extraordinary speculation, a meditation, I think is a better word, on the ways in which we are all, in some sense, dehumanized and rendered less than human through the system. And so part of, I think, your incredibly compelling style in which you compare race and caste precisely has to do with the ways in which you use narrative and story in order to actually, bring alive the persistence of this order, as you say, this kind of millennial in the Indian case, and 500 years plus in the United States. So I wanted to sort of begin with that, and also use that as a way to ask the first question that we have from one of the members of our audience, who asks, do you think that using the term casteism rather than racism today in the US makes the country's systemic racism more visible? In other words, what is gained by using caste and casteism instead of race and racism? And I think there's a broader question here also about the use of comparison, and we'd love to hear what you think about this.
Well, I think that by looking at the points of intersection, and again, as I've said, they are not the same. They're absolutely not the same. The countries are very different, and the versions or manifestations of hierarchy are different, clearly, but there are points of intersection. And I think those points of intersection allow us to be able to see the human toll and the human commonality with a graded ranking. What is it that we can learn from one another? What are the points of intersection that allow us to be able to see beneath what we think we do? I mean, there's obviously in both countries, both societies, there's a desire to sort of see, how could racism help to illuminate caste in India? How then, in this case, could caste allow Americans to maybe better understand the idea of racism in this country? One of the reasons why I think that this is especially helpful and illuminating is that because language that gets used for so long almost loses its power because we are so accustomed to hearing it. We often don't even agree on what the words mean. There's not a common agreement among lay people in particular. I mean, social scientists have a general idea, a general definition for what racism is, meaning prejudice and power, the power to enact and enforce that prejudice. But lay people are all over the map when it comes to what they think racism is. I mean, racism is viewed as a feeling for some people. It's viewed as just not liking people. It's viewed as hate. People are all over the map with what that means. When we add other words to it, other modifiers to racism, systemic racism, internalized racism, all of these things become modifiers of something that people already are often at odds with in terms of the meaning. And the other thing about racism, which of course exists, but the other thing about racism in the way that we use it is that it tends to instantly evoke certain emotions, the emotions of guilt and shame and blame that can obstruct the ability to be able to press past these issues, to be able to truly understand what is at work. It can often shut off conversation before it can even begin, can obstruct dialogue before you can even start. And so the idea of bringing in language that has been used by others who have studied American structure, particularly the Jim Crow South, which is central to understanding the structure, the hierarchies in the United States. Because it has been used before, perhaps there is something that we can learn from it. And as Dr. Ambedkar said, it was not only natural, but necessary to be able to see the connections between these two places, not to say that they are the same in any way, but to say that there are enough things to learn from that can perhaps together begin to get underneath the phenomenon to be able to finally vanquish it. I mean, that would be the goal in all of this. That would be the goal that I would be seeking.
Thank you. And I think also, as you were mentioning, there is this very long history actually in the American context of the use of the term caste, right? That it begins to be used by missionaries. And I imagine that part of this is the kind of triangulation of Britain, India, and the United States, you know, from the 1810s and 20s on. So it becomes a term that's beginning to be used by missionaries and people who are thinking about abolition in some context, and then begins to transform into a kind of sociological category, I suppose. And I say this also because it brings me to the next question by Suraj Yengde, who has written a fantastic book called Caste Matters.
Yes,
again,
he has. It's up there.
Yes, speaking about, you know, the connections between race and caste, also drawing on race matters, right? So there's a vice versa. Yes. At both ends. Yes. But this question, I think, of comparison, the use of the term caste, and then maybe sociology is something that Suraj begins with. And he notes people commenting on Wilkerson's work have not taken historical construction of sociology and Boasian anthropology in the United States and India as an approach seriously, and thus end up making shoddy claims. And of course, speaking of Boaz, this is another, I suppose, native son. We're sitting in the home of Boasian anthropology. And you know, this is, of course, a very important moment in the history of the disciplines more broadly. Wilkerson's work is a powerful testament to the genius of caste that's managed to live like a wild mushroom, Suraj says, in a contagious land brimming with race and class. We should welcome this work realigning American map to the histories of caste that instrumentalized the skin color distinction. Now the questions. What do you think was the reason behind promoting race as a structure of identification as opposed to caste that was fundamentally the primary reason to insert someone into a slave economy? So what does race do, I guess, that caste is not able to do at that time? And then the second question, what will it take for the future civil rights struggle of Black America to reckon with caste and its victims across the world? The earlier generation of activists seems to miss out on this important mark of solidarity, be it first half of the 20th century activism, or the Black Panthers, or even now. So you're making an argument about a kind of comparative advantage for historical comparison, but what do we do with struggles around solidarity and building affinity more broadly in the public world, I think is Suraj's question.
Yeah, well, I really, first of all, hello and thank you. And hello, Suraj. You know, the idea of race is a clever distraction from the underlying hierarchy, the underlying infrastructure of inequality and the arbitrary nature of the graded ranking. I mean, it becomes the major thing that people see and people get distracted from, so that they're not paying attention to what is happening that's actually holding everyone back. Because of course, one of the biggest, you know, the biggest victims, you might say, or the people who suffer, I should say, in ways that they don't realize, would be the people who I would describe as the lower class or the working class of the dominant caste, to use the language of Allison Davis, and Burleigh Gardner and Lloyd Warner, that they make the distinctions that way. And so that the people who are in the working class or the least, the poorest of the dominant caste are the ones who are so distracted by the presumed advantages of their whiteness that they do not see how the entire system is actually holding them back as well. It serves as a wedge that allows the system to maintain itself because people are distracted by what they think they see rather than what is underneath of it. I mean, I describe, caste as like the bones, the pillars and joists of a building, of an old house. And you cannot see the pillars and the joists. What you can see are the visible things, the wallpaper, the paint, the things that can be the tremendous distraction. But what you cannot see is what's underneath it. And you don't want to go into the basement when there's been, after rain, but you don't go into the basement at your own peril, because you may not want to think about what is actually going on there. So I view race as this brilliant distraction from the deeper, more embedded and more powerful impulse of division and the graded ranking. That is what keeps the society divided. It actually is a very powerful impulse to want to maintain hierarchy, and the hierarchy mutates and adjusts to the times. It adjusts to whatever is going on in order to maintain itself. I mean, I almost view it as an entity that will maintain itself at all costs. It adjusts to the moment in order to survive, and that's how I see caste as the underlying powerful force that needs to be conquered.
Thank you so much. I'll ask two questions, which I think maybe you could take up one on the other. One is from Kalia Brooks Nelson, who says, "Hi, Isabel, thank you very much for insightful and timely research. Can you repeat the dates you mentioned about the age of the US and enslavement?"
Yes, so the enslavement began in 1619. It did not end until 1865. It lasted thus for 246 years. It will not be until the year 2022 that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as enslavement lasted on this soil. And no adult will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as African Americans were enslaved. That will not happen until 2111. So unless there's some new cryogenic breakthrough, no adult will be alive at that point.
I'll ask you two questions that, thank you, that I think have to do broadly with set of questions, again, of social change and transformation, and please take them as you wish. One says, "I've noticed in my Generation Z peers a disenchantment with America's ability to dismantle the caste system that you spoke about. Do you think the stakeholders who benefit from the caste system are too powerful for meaningful change to occur?" And then there's another one about the contemporary moment that I know you didn't want to jump into kind of political analysis or speaking to the political present, but another asks about what it would take for our new president and vice president to address casteism and enact policies to effect the most meaningful change. And maybe the broader question of how, what's the arc of change? Is it legal? Is it around social movement organizing? Is it to internationalize this issue, as Suraj was asking? What is the level at which we think about working for social change?
Well, I want to say one thing that came to mind here when I heard the first question, and that is, to me, one of the most illuminating aspects of applying the term or the phenomenon of caste to a society such as that in the United States. And that is, it's the only phenomenon that I am aware of that really answers an enduring question that never seems to have another answer. And that is the idea that a caste system enlists everyone to maintain itself. A caste system does not exist solely because people at the top are repressing and oppressing those beneath them. That is happening, of course. But a caste system is sort of like, I think about the language of, in English, the word caste, how it's used without an E in our society. So we think about the mechanism that goes on to the fractured bones, to hold the fractured bones in place, caste. That is essentially a mechanism to keep something in a fixed place, caste. Then I also think about how it's used in theater, where you have a stage, and on that stage are the people who are in the cast of the play. So there's a person stage right, stage left, in the foreground and in the background, and everyone knows their lines. Everyone, those in the back know their lines, those in the front know their lines, and they know where they're supposed to be. And everyone knows their place. And if they're really invested, they know everyone's lines, they know everyone's place. And that means that is how the play can be performed. And if someone steps out of their place on that stage, then everything is thrown off and adjustments have to be made. And there may be people resisting. There may be people in the back who are resisting. In other words, everyone can be enlisted into maintaining the caste system, which is one of the reasons why I believe it's so enduring and so hard to overcome, because it requires everyone on some level to know the rules, to know the assumptions. I mean, there are many stories that I came across in studying and working on The Warmth of the Suns, in which there would be people in the subordinated group, African Americans, who would correct other Black people if they stepped out of line, because that was their job. There are many cases where people from the subordinated group were specifically chosen to be the ones to be the slave drivers, to be the ones who would be the ones assigned to whip their fellow subordinated people, because that gave them just a scrap more of privilege. I mean, this is how a caste system works, to co-opt everyone in the system in order to maintain it. So it is not just about the people at the top who are repressing those beneath them, which of course is happening, but it's also what's happening on the other levels of the caste system. And of course, Dr. Ambedkar made the point about, and also Cox made the point about how much of the greatest tension occurs not between the very top and the bottom, but the gradations in between. People who are more closely situated to each other. If you think about the rung on a ladder, if people are actually climbing onto a ladder, you will have a more of an ability to put your foot on the fingers of the people who are climbing beneath you than the person at the very, very top of the ladder. And that ends up being kind of the role. That's how the caste system maintains itself, because everyone knows their role. Everyone, if they're deeply invested in it, they will work very hard to maintain the hierarchy as it has been, even if they are not really flourishing, because that is what they're accustomed to and that is what they know. And unless people awaken, they will continue to police and maintain it. And that would be one way of looking at it.
Thank you. I guess this brings, and this question of sort of graded hierarchy, but also the orders of intimacy, for instance, within a caste system and the kind of racial caste system that you're speaking about. I wonder if I could jump in. You brought up the Hathras case as well, the question of gendered and sexual violence. And, our beloved colleague here, Saidiya Hartman, begins an essay by calling the plantation the belly of the world, and speaking to the ways in which gendered labor, the conscription of women, speaking about enslavement and slavery and so forth. But even in even with caste, as you know, Ambedkar's first essay, which is written here at Columbia University in 1916, Caste in India, is actually about the sexual orders, the reproduction of caste through the sexual regulation of women, right? And the question of endogamy and so forth. So I wonder, and thinking about the Hathras case, but of course, many, many other cases where caste violence takes on a powerfully gendered and sort of sexualized role. How do you see the relationship between race, caste, and gender? That's sort of the real underside, but it's actually that order of intimacy through which race and caste also perdure and endure. And that line, right, which is, miscegenation or intercaste, relations or marriage, is constantly breached. Yet it's something that in terms of in terms of a kind of legal order, in terms of a juridical imagination, is not meant to exist. So where do you see gender and sexual violence in all of this?
Well, yes, well, this speaks to intersectionality, the idea that, if you think of caste as the underlying infrastructure of divisions in a society, and that there are any number of metrics that can affect, characteristics that can affect or inform where one is situated in that hierarchy, then gender becomes yet another characteristic that can affect where one is situated in the hierarchy. Clearly, patriarchy situates men at the very top, regardless of, within each caste, the men, in terms of patriarchy, would then have the more dominant role that society accords to them. And so there you get the intersectionality in which where the gender of the individual based on their caste can also affect what their rights, privileges, their vulnerabilities may be. Clearly enslaved women throughout much of our country's history, again, 246 years, and then after that, the Jim Crow system that existed meant that African-American women were at the very, very bottom of the hierarchy by gender and by race in terms of the caste system. And so therefore they were in great peril at all times. They were at risk by, obviously by the slave holders, and also after enslavement ended by people who were white men and other men. So that meant that they were at the very bottom in the same way that we're speaking of Dalit women. And so the other thing I would add to that is that when we think about people, when we think about women in the caste system, we have to also think about the ways in which caste, one's placement in terms of being in a dominant caste or subjugated caste, can also affect, like, what is the individual identifying with in terms of the power position that they may have. So in this election, I didn't want to get into the election, but in this election, we found that women in what I describe as the dominant caste voted in a particular way. In 2016, they did not vote for an individual who looked like them, Hillary Clinton. They voted for an individual who, it could be argued, was, in the campaign actually expressing a desire to maintain the hierarchy. And the women were thus responding to what was the greater benefit to them. They identified with what I would call their caste position, the position that put them one up or gave them the greatest power or dominance, and that would be being white, which is the metric that's used to determine who fits where in the society. And so that was what they did. So it works both ways. It works both ways. In this case, in 2020, the same group of women who were in the dominant caste voted overwhelmingly for the individual that was representing himself as maintaining hierarchy as we had known it. They made the calculation, the majority of these women made the calculation that they would fare better with the maintenance of a system that privileged the caste to which they belonged.
You sort of following, or maybe where you ended, I'll just read a question that, since you spoke about the current elections, so there was a question saying, how might Kamala Harris, as an heir of the caste systems of India and the US, shed light on these realities? And of course, she occupies a very interesting role as somebody who comes from a Brahmin. She's a Tamil Brahmin, but then identified with, in terms of her political position, identifies with an entire history of civil rights and struggle, anti-racist struggle. So what do you wish for her to say or do as our first African-American, Indian, American woman VP is one question. And then slightly differently, because we've got a few questions lined up here. The second is, asks, caste in South Asia is often associated with a religious cosmology. To what extent do you think that religious sensibilities and justifications underpin the caste system in the US? Thinking here as well of Ambedkar's interest in Buddhism in relation to MLK Christianity and Malcolm X Islam. And this is from Matthew Engelke, who heads the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, who is also one of our supporters this evening. And I believe that I perhaps did not mention that in my long list of many institutes and centers. So thank you, Matthew, for your question as well.
Yeah, well, as for the religious underpinnings, that was what, if anyone has had a chance to read the book, they know that I, in the course of the research that I was doing, I began to compile what I call the 8 pillars of caste. I was able to identify 8 distinct hallmarks, characteristics of a caste system, which in order to be included needed to be consistent and apparent in any caste system. And the first one was divine law, or the laws of nature. And of course, we don't often think of that in the United States, but the essential framework for the American caste system was slavery. Slavery was creating a bottom caste out of nothing. It created a bottom caste because the society, the colonists needed people to build the colony out of wilderness, and they brought in, they imported the bottom caste. That was the purpose for being there. And in doing so, they then justified their assignment of this group of people to the very bottom of the society by evoking the book of Genesis and the story of Noah, and of his 3 sons, and of the son who had come upon his father while he was naked, and then that son was cursed. And all of and his descendants were cursed, and so this was viewed as the curse of Ham, that attended to people who the interpreters, the 14th, 15th, 16th century interpreters of the Old Testament decided that Ham and his descendants were Black, and that was how they justified what they viewed as the perpetual enslavement of the descendants of Ham. So there was a religious underpinning. Many of the enslavers made reference to this time and time again. They made it as they were entering the Civil War to affirm the righteousness of their cause. And so, yes, I mean, religion has been used for many in many ways to subjugate people, and it certainly was used here in the United States. When it comes to Kamala Harris and her background is such a fascinating one, and an illuminating one for America at this moment, because she is the daughter of a Jamaican immigrant who was himself thus a part of the African diaspora, but through the Caribbean, and then also a daughter clearly of an upper caste woman whom immigrated from India to the United States, and then got very devoted her work and her life to civil rights in this country. So it's such a fascinating background, and the combination of her background speaks to what I would call the middle caste within this bipolar system. The system was created as a bipolar one, with originating with the exclusion essentially of the indigenous people from it, and then the creation of a two-tiered system with the British colonists on top, and of course, as I said, African enslaved people at the bottom. And as anyone entered into this bipolar system, they had to navigate and figure out where do they fit in, because the system was set up in such a way. And it meant that people who were coming in from other parts of Europe even had to figure out where they were going to be situated. And of course, as we were saying, race is a social construct, but it's also a fairly new one, particularly when you think about the millennia-long history of countries such as India. And so that when they arrived, they may have arrived from Ireland or from Poland or from Hungary, and they would have not had any reason to think of themselves by the designation of white. I mean, white would have had no meaning. I mean, where they were from, Poland or Hungary or Ukraine or wherever they were from, I mean, they were surrounded by people who looked like them. And so the color of their skin would not have been the primary designation for how they identified themselves. But upon arriving here, they were navigating a bipolar system, and it turned out that they didn't even have a choice really as to what they would be designated as. They were designated as white, depending upon the decade and century that they arrived here, because even the idea of white was a provisional term that mutated with the times depending upon what the country's needs were as the country was curating its population, so that the 1924 Immigration Act would have eliminated or made it more difficult for people who were not from Northern and Western Europe to immigrate. And so this is an example of how of Kamala Harris representing the later waves of people who arrived to this country, particularly after the 1965 Immigration Act, that opened up the way for people outside of the traditional sources of population. Also, of course, as a result of the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, this 1965 was also the same year as the Voting Rights Act. And so all of this was coming together to help to open up a way for people from outside of the traditional sending countries that made up the United States. And in doing so, that meant that people in those middle castes then had to navigate and figure out where will they fit, how will they adjust. And one of the things that a caste system does is it rewards people. It rewards people for and encourages people to accede to the will and the expectations and the protocols of the dominant group in order to survive. And so that's one of the things that caste does. It also is one of the lesser, I think, recognized aspects of how divisive caste can be. And again, as I've said so many times, the wish is that we can transcend this, recognize what is going on, to be able to transcend these divisions and these false barriers. And I believe that she is in a position to help us break through if she chooses to do so because of what her own lineage represents.
Thank you so much. I've got 3 questions for you that are kind of permutations and combinations, I think, on the same theme, and they come back to this question of comparison. Lauren Simon says a distinction between caste in South Asia and the US is that untouchables were ruled from childhood that their birth was their own doing in prior lives, yet slaves in the US surely would have deeply felt the injustice of their situation. Is this right to you? Now, here's an alternative to that comparison, or that question of comparison. Sophie Levesque asks, should we contrast explicit caste systems, Jim Crow, compared to more implicit caste systems, America today, for example? Is it reasonable to think that today's caste structure is more damaging than that of the mid-20th century, since so many participants today are not conscious of or even hostile to are hostile to the suggestion of the existence of caste? I think this is really interesting about historical change, right? Yeah. And then the final question, again, another iteration on this theme, is Joaquin Orisemena, who asks, thank you for your wonderful insights. I was wondering, what is the role social mobility plays in the caste system in the US? The US currently ranks 27 in the global social mobility ranking. Are these measurements accurate? So one is about historical movement, the other one is about social movement and transformation. And then there is a kind of, can we pose the comparison at all? And then I'll come to the next.
Well, let me say that what I want to first address is the issue of social mobility and the issue of class, which has not come up today. The issue of class is yet another characteristic that can affect one's life chances. But I describe caste as the bones, race as the skin, and class as the accents, diction, education, clothing, the things that we can adjust about ourselves in trying to position ourselves differently from what we might have been born to. And class mobility is what the United States prides itself on, that anyone can be anything in society. And yet I find that class becomes, in some ways, like the dye that is used in arteries to identify what's happening with the arteries. Class allows us to see caste more clearly, because the idea is that if you have accounted for every possible factor as to how or why you should be in a particular place that you want to achieve, whatever it may be, and you still are running into barriers, then you've accounted for everything and there's very little left than the embedded assumptions about who should be where in a society. And so I would say that, there's a really good example out of the UK of the editor of British Vogue, who happened to have been of Ghanaian British descent. So he was Black, and he was clearly one of the best dressed, most sophisticated people on the planet. He's the editor of British Vogue. And as he was attempting to just walk into the office, his office building one day over the summer, the security guard stopped him and told him he needed to use the freight elevator. He looked at him, he took one look at him, he saw the cue, the signifier, the metric of where a person belongs, and he instantly just directed him to the freight elevator. And so what I say, one way of looking at that is that if you can act your way out of it, it's class. If you cannot act your way out of it, it's caste. Again, it's that embedded autonomic assumption about where a person belongs, who should be doing what, who should be where in a society that's autonomic and subconscious, the subconscious biases that undergird that. So, my response to the idea of social mobility is that we have seen that sometimes the greatest tensions occur when people are breaching the boundaries of their caste. And that is where they will run into greater resistance. And we saw what happened, for example, President Barack Obama has a new book coming out on Tuesday, and in it he has assessing his situation, in which we saw all of the restrictions. I mean, someone actually stood up in open Congress of both houses of the legislature and just rose up and attacked him and said, "You lie." I mean, this is a kind of like breaking with protocol of the ages. So we have seen that when people breach the boundaries of caste, that there is a response because people recognize that they are breaching, and it's more likely to happen. Breaches are more likely to happen the higher you rise in the society. And so that's where the intersection of class and caste can in some ways inform each other, I would say. When it comes to the presumed acceptance of one's lowest status in a caste system, I have to push back against the assumptions that any group of people anywhere on the planet happily accepts degradation, stigmatization, and dehumanization. I just have to push back against that. I believe that human beings are more alike than they are different. I think that when people will say, why do those people do this and why do those people do that? I believe that there's only one answer to that question. What do human beings do in that particular situation? I would say that, in order to survive, African Americans during the 246 years of enslavement, meaning 12 generations, where you cannot even begin to see when or how your children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren will ever be able to escape. In order to survive, they had to adjust themselves. They had to recognize that they were outnumbered and outgunned, and many of the attempts at uprisings were often thwarted, often because there was someone who was paid or who felt that they could gain some advantage by selling out their fellow enslaved people. So that's the evil underbelly of what happens in a caste system. And in order to survive, the people in enslavement and Dalits or the former Untouchables for generations, I'm saying that the response is the human response to the circumstances that they happen to be in. And I would suggest that it's not as different as people might assume it to be. Because in order to survive, the people had to know and stay in their place and hope and pray that in time, eventually, they would all be free.
Thank you so much. I think we will have time for the final 3 questions. I'll put them to you briefly, And if you can take those up, and then I think sadly we are getting to the end of our time with you. So you ended where one of our questioners has a further question for you. Basili Deb asks, I would like to draw attention to the issue of slave drivers that you referred to. That legacy continues even today to deport non-citizens from this country. She goes on to ask, what are your thoughts on holding individual agents of systemic oppression accountable? Do solidarity movements only hold people at the top accountable? Or do we also hold contemporary slave drivers accountable as well? So this very difficult question of how you are embedded in the system and the sort of shared structures of both privilege, but also of stigmatization. And then Balmurli Natrajan writes, thank you, Isabel, for writing such a stunningly rich and searing critique of both race and caste. And we'll come back around to the question that I think Pamela Smith posed right at the start. What's the value in a sense of comparison? You've made caste travel, Balmurli says, in a world where the concept of race usually travels as an imperial category to societies. Your anti-caste, anti-race project provincializes race by forcing it to be viewed through the lens of caste. Or kind of iteration on that first question. Do you think your book will help dominant caste Americans start thinking that they are as capable of savagery as those already classified as savages? So what's the kind of reckoning that we're thinking about? I think the final question, or I'll ask you both very quickly, but you can decide which ones you want to take on. Thank you, Isabel, for your talk and for your book and this illuminating talk, Alexa Lehosky. My question has to do with the underlying pattern historically for hierarchy in agricultural, industrial, capitalist systems. While we work to dismantle caste and systemic racism, how do we evolve the framework so that we can transcend it rather than allow it to mutate? Are there systems in place that we can look to for inspiration? And I think this keeps coming back to the question of social reproduction versus social revolution, if I can put it that way. And then the final question is about the fluidity of caste that we see in South Asian society, and whether that is useful in thinking about caste in the racialized social infrastructure and architecture of the United States. Must caste as related to race be fixed? So I will leave you with those questions. Please take on whichever ones you wish in whatever way, and then we will bring our session with you to a close. Thank you.
Well, that's a lot of questions that each one could take another half hour to together. But I would say that I'm most intrigued by the one that talks about the savagery. I would say that dehumanizing others. The goal of this is to remind ourselves that in dehumanizing others, those in the dominant group who have been in the midst of that project have actually been dehumanizing themselves. I would say that if you're in the Jim Crow world, and for example, they were holding an entire group of people down in a ditch. But in order to hold them down in the ditch, they had to get in the ditch with them. And so while they were holding a group down in the ditch, and the other group was being held down in a ditch, none of them were able to achieve and to be what they could have been. None of them were able to actually become what their talents and gifts might have otherwise been. They were holding everyone back. And the lesson from the South is that as long as that system was formally in place, that region of the country lagged the rest of the country. In fact, aspects of it still do lag the country in terms of educational achievement, high school graduation rates, and others. But for in a very dramatic way, that part of the country lagged the rest of the country by almost every metric, because the dominant group, the dominant caste, was expending so much energy to hold down an entire other group, thus dehumanizing everyone and holding the entire enterprise, the entire region down. And so one of the goals of this work is to show in many different directions, the ways that caste hurts everybody. Everybody suffers. We may not be able to see how we're suffering. We may have been, fallen under the spell of the illusion of primacy for the dominant group. We may have fallen under the spell of, at least, for those in the middle caste, or those who are just in the upper rung of the lowest caste, that at least I'm not at the bottom. These are all of the ways, these are what I would call the tentacles and consequences of caste that hurt us so much. In the United States, for example, this happens to be a country that is kind of singular in the Western world in the sense of withholding or not making available to all of its people something so basic as healthcare. I mean, other countries in the Western world, Western parallel countries have had, universal health coverage. It's not unusual. There's a sense of, for some of the countries, particularly such countries as Finland, for example, there's a sense of shared investment in one's fellow citizens. These deep divisions mean that individuals do not see the common connection to people who are in the same country as them, and would be willing to vote against policies that could help everyone for fear that it might help those that they deem beneath them, unworthy, undeserved, and thus hurting everyone. And, I came to the realization of that when there's a reference in the book to this one set of interviews that were done with people on the street in Britain and in London. And they were all asked the question, what do you think it costs for an American to get a particular thing done when it comes to healthcare? Like, how much does it cost, for example, to have a baby? How much does it cost? And they were asking them to guess, and they were wildly off base, completely got all the questions wrong. And when asked, one woman was said, well, how much do you think it costs to have a baby in the United States? And she was told $5,000, $6,000. And she said, what? To have a baby? That's crazy. She just couldn't believe it. Another man was asked, how much do you think it costs for an American to get an ambulance to take them from their home to the hospital when they have an emergency? And he said, they charge for that? There's a fee for an ambulance to take you to the hospital when you have an emergency. He could not believe it. They just couldn't believe it. And so I think that we have been so isolated and so unaware, not interrogating the circumstances here. We've lived with it for so long. We've lived with the caste system for so long. We've lived with inequality for so long that we have taken this to be the laws of nature, that this is the way that it should be. And what this work is asking of all of us is to search ourselves, to learn the history, to get on the same page about the history of this country, because the vast majority of people actually don't know the history. And I can say this, with experience, because when The Warmth of the Suns first came out, people came up to me time and time again. And no matter their background or wherever they might have been in the country, they would say, I had no idea. I had no idea that this happened in the country. For those who were the oldest among them, they would say, I had no idea that this happened in my lifetime. They said, I had no idea. And I like to point to, I made many trips to Berlin for this book. I made many trips, obviously, elsewhere to the UK and also to India, of course. But I went many times to Berlin. And in the middle of Berlin, a major world city, is a massive installation. And it happens to be several football fields wide. And this is a massive, massive installation in the middle of a major world city. And what that is, it is a memorial to those who perished in the Holocaust. And it's an installation of concrete blocks that go on and on and on, and the land underneath undulates. It's a massive structure. But one thing about that is that there's no signage. There's no signage. There are no walls of descriptors, exhibition area with explanation about what this is. There's no signage, and there's no signage because it's not necessary. People there learn the history. They learn the history of World War II from the earliest time that they're able to begin to understand it in grade school, and they learn it all through school. And everyone is on the same page about what happened there in that country. So there's not even the need for signage. And yet here we have such a long way to go. We're not even in agreement about what we don't agree on. You know, we're not in agreement about basic facts about the Civil War. Most people do not really know about, you know, truly what the, you know, what Reconstruction was. Many people do not know, don't truly know what the Jim Crow era was like. They know the pictures of the colored water fountains and the white only water fountains, but they don't know how all-encompassing, comprehensive repression and authoritarian regime that it actually was. And so it's time that we all got on the same page, because, you know, not having an idea, which so many people told me they had no idea, not having an idea has consequences. And it's imperative that we learn and know what happened in this country. It's imperative that we be able to see beneath what we thought we knew, to be able to see the hidden infrastructure of our divisions, to be able to see the architecture of what we've inherited, and to be able to recognize, to search ourselves, to see how we have been programmed, to deprogram ourselves, so that together we can come together and recognize what we have in common with other similar societies and hierarchies, so that together we can find a way to finally dismantle that which has been really dividing all of us.
Thank you very, very much. I think we want to thank you for giving us your time. I think yours is it's a lyric voice, it's a prophetic voice that speaks to what you began with, which is the existential crisis that we find ourselves in, and that the project of rehumanizing ourselves is, you know, to start with an analysis of the modes of dehumanization, the systemic forms, the practices, the social practices, but also the ways in which there is a kind of psychic order, if you will, that really needs a kind of excavation. And it has been so wonderful to have you with us. And I think for somebody who, again, studies the world of caste and anti-caste movements and so on, indeed, to have somebody who brings caste, or to globalize, you know, thinks about this as a project of globalizing caste, as a project of denaturalizing what we thought we always knew. I cannot tell you how significant this is for many, many, many of us who've been attending your talk today, and many others as well. What kind of a signal shift, a reorientation your work has been. So this is with incredible gratitude for, you know, doing this, for writing your book, and most importantly for being with us today in this very strange, odd virtual space, but very, very much appreciated. So thank you, and Jai Bhim. And
thank you.
Good evening, everybody else. Thank you for spending your Friday evening with us on this incredible journey. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.